truth didn't vanish, it changed hands. Once, we imagined it seated on a throne, anchored in nature, reason, or God. Today, it travels through platforms, protocols, and metrics, claimed by whoever can make a version of the world most legible, most repeatable, most clickable. Post-truth is not the death of facts. It's the privatization of credibility, the transfer of epistemic authority from shared institutions to competitive systems of visibility. The question is no longer only what is true, but who has the power to make a truth operational. Nietzsche saw the fault line first, not as a scandal, but as a diagnosis. What we call truth was never a naked mirror of reality. It was a style of survival, a pact of metaphors hardened into law. That insight doesn't license cynicism, it assigns responsibility. If truths are human-made, then meaning is our craft and our burden. Derrida will later give this motion a grammar, the double movement of difference. Both difference and deferral, where meaning slides and never finally arrives. Foucault will show how institutions authorize some utterances as knowledge, yet always leave room for resistance within those regimes of truth. Baudrillard will push the knife further, to the point where models don't reflect the real so much as pre-produce it, completing the turn from symbolic exchange to pure simulation. Together, they don't announce apocalypse, they map the terrain we actually inhabit. Look around. A graph outranks a testimony, a trend line outvotes a memory. Feeds don't merely display events, they sequence them into plausibility. We experience not an absence of reality, but a surplus of versions, each vying for the right to count. The center of gravity has moved from correspondence to circulation. What persists is what integrates best with the code. This video is not nostalgia for a lost foundation. It is a field guide for living without one. We will move from Nietzsche's suspicion to the contemporary spectacle, where truth competes with entertainment, to hyperreality, where signs outpace events, to the algorithmic regimes that curate what can appear at all. And finally, to a wager. If truth no longer guarantees meaning, then interpretation is not an indulgence, it is an ethics. This video explores how truth has changed hands, from Nietzsche's idea of illusion to Baudrillard's world of simulation. The material turned out so vast that I decided to divide it into two parts. In this first episode, we'll trace how truth gradually transformed, from a philosophical concept into a cultural performance, from belief into spectacle. In the second part, we'll ask a harder question. What happens when algorithms and social media start deciding what counts as true? So, let's begin where truth first started to fracture. If you find yourself drawn to these questions about truth, meaning, and illusion, you can subscribe and stay close to this line of thought. Here, every video continues the previous one, like a single conversation that never really ends. Post-truth became the word of the year in 2016. But the idea was born long before hashtags and headlines. Nietzsche had already diagnosed the disease behind it, in On Truth and Lies in a Non-Moral Sense. 1873, he writes, "What then is truth? A mobile army of metaphors, metonymies, anthropomorphisms. Truths are illusions which we have forgotten are illusions." For Nietzsche, truth is not the reflection of being, but the residue of power, the stabilization of language that life once found useful. A mobile army, because each word is a conquest. A forgetting, because every conquest hides its violence. Yet for Nietzsche, this is not a cynical relativism. Truth functions biologically, even aesthetically, as a life-promoting fiction, lebensfördernd, not a utilitarian tool. The falsity of judgment is not its flaw, but its vitality. Post-truth, in this light, is not a historical novelty, but a return, the moment when the illusion remembers itself as illusion. Our age did not abolish truth. It exposed its genealogy. I explored this turning point more deeply in my Nietzsche video, how truth first appeared not as discovery, but as invention. And now, we're watching that invention escape its creator. When Nietzsche dismantled the metaphysical dream of aletheia, truth as unconcealment, he foresaw that the world would no longer be ruled by facts, but by forces. As he writes in The Gay Science, it is precisely facts that do not exist, only interpretations. Interpretation, then, is not the corruption of truth. It is its condition. Every fact is already an interpretation that has triumphed. Jean-François Lyotard will later echo this transformation in The Postmodern Condition, 1979. Simplifying to the extreme, I define postmodern as incredulity toward meta-narratives, when the grand narratives of reason, progress, or science lose their authority. Truth no longer legitimates itself through universality, but through performance, through what Lyotard calls language games. In this sense, post-truth is simply the political name for postmodernity. Michel Foucault would add another layer. Truth is not timeless, but regime-bound. Each society has its regime of truth, its general politics of truth, he notes in Truth and Power, 1977. What we call truth is a field of power relations, institutions, protocols, and practices that decide which statements are allowed to count. Yet for Foucault, power never fully closes the circle. Every regime of truth also creates spaces for resistance, counter-discourses, refusals, and reappropriations that keep truth mobile. The post-truth era does not lack truth, it multiplies regimes. Baudrillard radicalizes the diagnosis. We live in a world where there is more and more information, and less meaning. Simulacra and Simulation, 1981. Here, truth no longer dies. It proliferates until distinction becomes impossible. From symbolic exchange to pure simulation, reality moves through 4 stages: imitation, production, representation, and finally, the simulacrum, a sign with no reference. The newsfeed is not the collapse of truth, but its metastasis, too many mirrors, none of them grounding reflection. Even Gianni Vattimo, writing from a later, quieter horizon, calls this pensiero debole, weak thought. He does not mourn the loss of certainty. He sees in it an ethical demand. If there is no single truth, we must learn to live among interpretations responsibly. The weakening of truth, he writes, is not decadence, but the opening of dialogue. In Vattimo's hermeneutic sense, this weakening is not decay, but the humanization of reason, truth that listens instead of commands. Thus, post-truth is neither a scandal nor a slogan. It is the culmination of a long philosophical arc, from Nietzsche's metaphors to Derrida's différance, both difference and différal, to Foucault's regimes, to Baudrillard's simulations. Each step loosens truth from foundation and ties it to relation. So the question is no longer whether truth exists, but who operates its machinery. Whose metaphors became metrics, whose discourse became data, and whose algorithms now decide what can appear as true. Nietzsche never used the phrase post-truth, but he dissected its anatomy long before it became a political buzzword. In the late 19th century, he already saw that Western thought was built on an aesthetic illusion, that behind every claim to truth lies an act of creation disguised as discovery. In On Truth and Lies in a Non-Moral Sense, he describes human beings as fragile artists, inventing stability amid chaos. The intellect, as a means for the preservation of the individual, develops its chief powers in dissimulation. Deception, flattery, lying, and cheating belong to the general economy of life. Truth, then, is not the opposite of the lie. It is the most successful one. It is a metaphor that no longer feels like a metaphor, a fiction that has forgotten its origin. Nietzsche is not celebrating deceit. He is revealing that truth functions biologically and aesthetically as a creative illusion that sustains life, not a utilitarian mechanism for control. That is why in The Gay Science, AIandTruth 344, he writes, "The will to truth that is to tempt us to many a hazardous enterprise, that famous veracity of which all philosophers have hitherto spoken with reverence. What questions has this will to truth not laid before us? This will to truth, the instinct to sanctify our own fictions, becomes, for Nietzsche, the last form of faith left after God's death. We worship the method, the system, the data, not because they reveal reality, but because they offer orientation in a world without guarantees. That is why he calls for an Umwertung aller Werte, a revaluation of all values, not to destroy meaning, but to liberate it from obedience. Truth must cease to be a commandment and become a creation." He writes in The Gay Science section 58, "The falseness of a judgment is to us not necessarily an objection to a judgment. The question is to what extent it is life-promoting, life-preserving, perhaps even species-preserving. In this light, the so-called post-truth era is not a deviation from Nietzsche. It is his logic industrialized. Where he once said that truths are illusions, which we have forgotten are illusions, today's algorithmic systems turn those illusions into code. They quantify the very usefulness of belief, engagement, reach, virality. Nietzsche's mobile army of metaphors has become a literal army, lines of computation marching across screens, shaping what will count as real." Here, Derrida's notion of difference, 1968, gives the Nietzschean intuition a grammar, a double movement of deferral and differentiation, in which meaning is generated through spacing and delay rather than presence. I explored this concept in my Derrida video, how meaning never lands once and for all, but keeps moving through signs and interpretations. It's the same restless motion Nietzsche intuited, only now given a language of its own. Meaning, Derrida argues, is always deferred. Each sign points not to a presence, but to another sign. In this infinite deferral, there is no final ground, only the movement of traces. Nietzsche had sensed it intuitively. The world of truths is a network of metaphors in motion. Derrida simply revealed that this motion is the condition of meaning itself. Baudrillard, a century later, radicalized the same trajectory. He writes in Simulacra and Simulation, 1981, "The simulacrum is never that which conceals the truth. It is the truth which conceals that there is none." If Nietzsche unmasked truth as fiction, Baudrillard shows what happens when fiction stops pretending, when simulation becomes the new metaphysics. The symbolic exchange that once bound meaning to reciprocity dissolves into pure simulation, where signs reproduce themselves without reference. And Foucault, reading Nietzsche historically, translates the insight into his concept of regimes of truth. Each society has its regime of truth, its general politics of truth. In other words, truth is not universal, it is governed. Our institutions, algorithms, and languages are not neutral observers. They are the engineers of belief. Yet, as in Foucault's model of power, this governance is never absolute. Every structure that produces truth simultaneously produces the possibility of resistance. Nietzsche foresaw this, a world where truth no longer rests on correspondence, but on effectiveness. He wrote, "Truth is that kind of error without which a certain species could not live. In the 21st century, that species is the algorithmic ecosystem, systems that survive not by being true, but by being efficient. But this efficiency is not an epistemic virtue. It is a new form of will to power, the triumph of what circulates over what endures. Deleuze, reflecting on Nietzsche, would later call this shift the reversal of Platonism. No longer the copy serving the original, but the simulacrum producing the real. For Deleuze, this reversal is not merely historical, it is ontological. Being itself becomes difference in production. It is this reversal that defines our post-truth landscape, a world where representation no longer reports on being, but generates it. Nietzsche did not predict the collapse of truth. He predicted its metamorphosis, from revelation to creation, from metaphysical mirror to digital performance. He gave us the tools to survive this transformation, but also the warning: beware, lest in casting out your demon, you cast out the best thing in you. Beyond Good and Evil, section 117. Because when the search for truth becomes only a search for confirmation, the will to truth decays into the will to comfort. And at that point, post-truth is not an era, it's an instinct. Once, American journalism trained us to hear truth as a tone. Walter Cronkite ended the evening with, "And that's the way it is." And the sentence functioned like a seal. Truth as calm authority. But as formats shifted, from nightly summaries to rolling coverage, the ground moved. Truth stopped arriving as a verdict and started arriving as a show. Guy Debord named the mechanism before cable perfected it. Everything that was directly lived has moved away into a representation. The Society of the Spectacle, 1967. What he meant is not lies on TV, but that experience itself is reorganized by the need to appear. The newsroom learned to stage reality, so it could be seen, repeated, and monetized. 3 levers did most of the work. 1. Framing as event. Marshall McLuhan's line remains surgical. The medium is the message. Understanding media, 1964. Form overdetermines meaning. The modern breaking news banner doesn't just announce an event, it produces eventness. Music, stings, red chirons, countdown clocks. Even a routine development is recoded as crisis by tempo and typography. Truth acquires an adrenaline signature, and adrenaline reads as real. For McLuhan, the medium is not a neutral conduit, but a total environment that shapes what counts as perceptible, thus as believable. 2. Visuals as verification. A picture is no longer illustration, it is proof by performance. 2 emblematic cases show both sides of the impulse. Dewey defeats Truman, 1948. In the race to be first, a headline pre-performed reality. The photograph of Truman hoisting the wrong front page is now journalism's memento mori. Speed can impersonate truth so well that it feels identical until it isn't. Dateline NBC's GM Truck segment, 1992. To dramatize risk, producers staged an explosion with model rocket igniters and extra fuel. The image was unforgettable. The truth was injured. The scandal didn't merely expose misconduct, it revealed a structural temptation. When visibility becomes the test of truth, spectacle drifts into fabrication. 3. Rituals of authority. Foucault helps us read the newsroom as a truth factory. The production of discourse is at once controlled, selected, organized, and redistributed. The Order of Discourse, 1970. Authority. Today is signaled not only by bylines and sources, but by studio grammar, multi-screen walls, animated data, augmented explainers. Consider the Weather Channel's mixed reality hurricane demos, presenters standing inside a simulated storm surge. This is pedagogy by immersion, deeply useful, but also a confession. That persuasion now requires theatrical form. We don't just hear about surge heights, we feel them. Feeling becomes epistemic. Foucault would remind us that this is not simply domination, but circulation, power, and truth co-produce one another through repetition and form. As Baudrillard shows, circulation begins to outpace interpretation. Performance metrics start to precede context. He is not saying we know less. He is saying that circulation can outpace interpretation. When the feed optimizes for immediacy, truth is rewarded for performance metrics, clarity of framing, intensity of visuals, ritual markers of authority, before it is rewarded for context. Repetition stabilizes belief faster than verification can. Where Debord still lamented the loss of lived experience to representation, Baudrillard shows the next stage. Representation detaching from any real at all, the spectacle evolving into simulation. I explored this transition further in my Baudrillard video, how simulation doesn't just replace the real, but absorbs it. There, the copy no longer hides its artificiality, it thrives on it. And that is precisely the world we now inhabit, where visibility itself becomes the proof of existence. None of this implies that journalism has abandoned truth. It implies that truth has a form factor. In a saturated attention market, what convinces must also compete. The risk is not that facts vanish, but that they survive by adapting to an aesthetic that can erode the slow work of understanding. So what philosophically has changed? Nietzsche already told us that whatever is profound loves masks. Modern media universalize the mask as method. The mask is not necessarily deceit, it is the necessary staging through which meaning appears at all. Debord names the social logic of that staging, McLuhan the technical logic, Foucault the institutional logic. Together, they describe the drift from truth as correspondence to truth as performance, a shift from epistemology to aesthetics, and finally, to ontology. Two practical consequences follow. Epistemic style matters. Rhythm, repetition, and ritual now carry part of truth's weight. If we ignore style, we misread substance. Verification must invent its own theater. Explanatory journalism, open sourcing, and transparent corrections are not branding. They are counter-performances, forms designed to make slowness visible. From here, the next step is almost inevitable. If staging becomes the precondition of believing, then we inch toward a world where the model precedes the event and teaches us what to see. In other words, what happens when everything becomes simulation? If this reflection speaks to you, share it. Philosophy survives only when it circulates, not as doctrine, but as dialogue. And sometimes, one shared video is enough to keep that dialogue alive. When Baudrillard wrote that we live in a world where there is more and more information and less meaning, he was not describing confusion, he was describing structure. Too much meaning collapses into noise. Too many mirrors erase reflection. And when every image begins to behave as a world, the question, is this true, loses its gravity. That is the moment of simulation, when the copy no longer imitates the original because the original has ceased to matter. Baudrillard's metaphor of Disneyland was never about a theme park. It was an X-ray of modern faith. He wrote, "Disneyland exists to hide that it is the real country, all of real America, which is Disneyland." The park doesn't deceive us, it comforts us. By naming itself illusion, it persuades us that authenticity must still exist somewhere else. And that, he says, is the deepest illusion of all. Baudrillard's move from symbolic exchange, where meaning is produced through reciprocal relations, to simulation, where meaning self-replicates without reference, marks a decisive philosophical break. We no longer lose contact with the real, we lose the very need for it. I explored this logic fully in the separate video on Baudrillard and Hyperreality. But here, let's take his insight further. Because simulation didn't end with amusement parks. It moved into our eyes, our screens, our metrics. In the age of data, the model has replaced the mirror. We no longer represent the world. We generate it through code, ranking, and optimization. An algorithm predicts what you will want before you feel the wanting. The stock market prices tomorrow's expectation before tomorrow exists. Reality becomes anticipatory, a future already rendered. That is what Baudrillard calls the procession of simulacra. It is no longer a question of imitation, nor duplication, nor even parody. It is a question of substituting the signs of the real for the real itself. Simulacra and Simulation, 1981. And here, we reach a philosophical threshold. Because the collapse of reference does not leave emptiness, it creates management. When truth can no longer be verified, it must be maintained. We debug the world like software. The aim is not correspondence, but coherence. Not is it true, but does it work? Foucault would recognize this shift immediately. I explored this recognition in my Foucault video, where truth and power form a single mechanism. There, knowledge doesn't describe the world, it organizes it. And today, that mechanism has migrated into algorithms. In Truth and Power, he wrote, "Each society has its regime of truth, the types of discourse which it accepts and makes function as true. In the digital order, that regime is algorithmic. The discourse that functions as true is the one that performs well, the video that holds attention, the sentence that aligns with preference, the model that predicts behavior. Truth survives as performance inside systems that reward functionality over fidelity." Yet, in Foucault's sense, power always carries the seed of resistance. The algorithmic regime, too, produces the margins where counter-discourses can still emerge. Moments when the code glitches and meaning leaks through. And this is where Nietzsche re-enters, quietly triumphant. He warned that when truth dies as correspondence, something else will rise in its place. Not chaos, but design. Truth is that kind of error without which a certain species could not live, the gay science, section 110. That error was never mere falsehood. It was an ontological strategy, the form through which life stabilizes its own becoming. That species is now digital humanity. We inhabit architectures of error optimized for survival, the feed, the metric, the model. Our fictions are no longer beliefs, they are interfaces. Baudrillard feared this as the desert of the real, but perhaps it is also the new terrain of meaning, because what dies here is not truth itself, but the metaphysical innocence of believing truth could exist outside interpretation. When everything becomes simulation, the ethical question changes. It's no longer, is this real? But what kind of reality does this create in me? Every act of interpretation becomes a moral act, because every choice of perspective shapes the fabric of what will appear. And here, we can glimpse the bridge to thinkers yet to come, Deleuze and Guattari, who will describe a world of endless production and flow, not as disorder, but as immanent creativity, Rancière, who will show that politics begins not in power, but in visibility, in what is allowed to appear, and Byung-Chul Han, who will diagnose the exhaustion that follows from total transparency, a world where nothing remains hidden, and therefore nothing can breathe. Each continues the same genealogy. The shift from the world as object to the world as operation. Ontology becomes procedural. Being becomes programmable. So when we say everything has become simulation, we are not lamenting loss. We are describing a world where truth has become procedural, where meaning exists only as long as someone sustains it, updates it, refreshes it. For Baudrillard, the real is assembled from models and memory banks, reproducible without limit. And yet, the question remains, not whether the real still exists, but whether we still do, when every gesture, every word, every belief is already a rehearsal. If simulation is the stage of truth, then philosophy's task is no longer to unmask it, but to remember that even on the stage, we can still improvise. And that improvisation, not exposure, is the last freedom left. The world Nietzsche imagined, where truths are only useful illusions, has already arrived. But illusions have evolved. They no longer hide, they perform. Every post, every headline, every image tries not to reflect the world, but to replace it. Truth didn't vanish. It changed its audience, and every illusion that wants to survive needs believers. If you want to follow where this thought leads next, hit the bell, or simply remember to return. The next chapter will take us deeper into the algorithms that now decide what becomes true. This discussion continues in part 2, Who Owns Truth Today? From Baudrillard to AI. Premieres October 14th on The Rational Voice.